but it does speak to the need for diplomacy, because ultimately the two panels together suggest that the best way to deal with these kinds of problems is to actually for us to stop pinging at each other, because the current endeavor is certainly not leading us into any place productive. So thanks again from Europe and from the United States. That was a really terrific panel, really thought-provoking. And thanks to Rachel, and good luck with the launching of ELCS. I'm very bad with acronyms, the Emerging Leaders in Canadian Security. And now we'll have our next panel, which is our Diversity Fireside Chat, organized by women of color advancing peace and security. I'm not sure if Dr. Siham Rayale is going to be, she's not here, so I don't know if she's on electronically or not. No. All right. So we'll just give it over to Esra Bengizi, who is the co-director and founder of Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security Canada, and she will introduce the panelists, and they'll have the conversation that will be most provocative about Islamophobia and national security in Canada. And so I'll let them get settled, and then Esra can take it away. So just give us a second to get resettled. And thank you very much. And then after this panel, we'll have lunch. To be clear, for the lunch, the food will be delivered to you. That is the COVID protocol of the day. So in case your stomachs are rumbling, we'll have food after this panel. All right, Esra, take it away. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much. Is this mic working? I don't know if you guys can hear me. Can everybody hear me? Great. So thank you so much for the warm welcome. I know you guys took that literally with the really cool swag bags and the hats and gloves, so that was pretty cool. So good morning, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for putting this event together and inviting the WCAPS-Canada chapter to participate. My name is Esra Bengizi. I'm the co-director of WCAPS-Canada. I'm also a PhD student at the University of Toronto. So WCAPS-Canada is just one of the many chapters of our organization, founded by Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins. And it's an organization where we seek to advance the leadership and professional development of women of color in the field of peace and security, as well as to promote anti-racism, diversity, and inclusion policies in national affairs and foreign affairs. To begin, today's discussion is happening on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to the time immemorial. WCAPS-Canada is an organization that is rooted in uplifting and centering the voices of racialized women in dialogue surrounding peace and security in Canada. This includes putting a spotlight on Indigenous women's experiences with state violence and the importance of grounding our work in reconciliation. I invite everyone here to reflect on the recommendations by the Truth and Reconciliations Commission and the ways that we can more meaningfully implement them, particularly as Canada continues to deal with the reckoning of the residential school system. By the end of the discussion, we hope you will consider connecting with us to learn more about our mission and ambitions at WCAPS-Canada, but also how you, your organization, or your institution can foster better collaboration and allyship with racialized women doing research and advocacy on peace and security in Canada and abroad. Our discussion today is titled National Security and Islamophobia. Muslim communities and individuals have been targets of state surveillance and policy that has discriminated, marginalized, and unlawfully incarcerated Muslims in the name of national security and counterterrorism. This conversation must extend from the local to the global, as we hope this conversation today not only sparks further dialogue, but adds to the chorus of voices calling for justice and protection of Muslims in Canada and abroad. Surveillance of Muslim Canadians has become the norm for federal law enforcement agencies, which contradict in the quote-unquote multicultural and diversity, as well as the religious tolerance narrative that Canada prides itself on, and the narrative that it constantly reinforces. This panel is important as we bring 4 experts to shed light on how counterterrorism and national security measures disproportionately target Muslims and racialized communities. The tragedy of September 11th, 2001 has generated significant consequences for Muslims around the world and reimagined the way that Muslims are perceived. despite Muslim states being the most impacted when it comes to extremist and violent terrorist incidents in many countries where terrorist groups are active. Moreover, Canadian Muslims were not excluded from the world's demonization of Muslims, as we saw a rise in hate crimes that targeted Muslim communities, including in 2017, when on January 29th, a Quebec mosque was violently attacked, claiming the lives of 6 Muslim men and injuring 19. More recently, we witnessed the London terror attack where a Muslim family was brutally murdered on June 6th of this year while walking in their neighborhood, or the countless attacks and threats targeted at mosques around the country and towards visible Muslim women who wear the hijab. This is why an intersectional and anti-racist approach to national security and defense is critical. Our panelists today will add more to this discussion and provide examples of the daily experience for Muslims that engage with security-centered institutions, including the police and CSIS. Merci de vous être joint à nous aujourd'hui dans.
Thank you very much for joining us today in the context of this dialogue on national phobia. I'd like to start by recognizing that we are here in the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe nation, who's been here since time immemorial. My name is Nabi Bengizi, and I'm a co-director of the WCAPS organization, Women of Color, Advancing Peace and Security. Our organization works on promoting the advancement, professional advancement of women in the area of international peace, security, and conflict transformation. In the middle of all of this adversity, inequalities, especially for Muslims, continue to persist, which in our case of Canadian Muslims leads to dialogue and reflection. Canadian Muslims from all countries continue to fear for their security, and so do Muslims throughout the world. Discrimination and racism still wreak havoc in our communities and in our country, and there are communities that still feel in danger. They feel betrayed by their government. Mortal terrorist attack motivated by hate in London, Ontario, reminds us of the emergency to take even more concrete measures to fight against Islamophobia and any form of racism and xenophobia. Today, 4 panelists are joining us for this very important conversation, and I would invite you to put questions to them at the end of the discussion.
Discussion with Senator Mobina Jaffer. Senator Jaffer represents the province of British Columbia in the Senate of Canada. She's a strong advocate for peace and inclusion and a champion of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Throughout her career, she has been focused on bridging the gaps between policy and reality, ensuring that the realities, particularly of those who are most vulnerable, are reflected in law and policy making. Senator Jaffer is a strong believer that communities are at the heart of any successful policy initiative and that women have the true knowledge of their communities. Senator Jaffar's global work on peace took her to the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, where she worked with women peace builders as well as governments to advance the peace agenda. As Canada's Special Envoy for Peace in Sudan, she succeeded in bringing Darfurian women to the peace table in 2002. A champion for human rights, diversity, and women, Senator Jaffer chaired the Standing Senate Committee on Human Rights for nearly a decade, as well as the Canadian Committee on Women, Peace and Security for 3 years. So Senator Jaffer, you have a unique perspective being the first Muslim senator, first senator of South Asian descent, and the first African-born senator who has constantly been a champion of social justice and who has done a lot of work in the field of peace and security with an anti-racist approach. Therefore, you are aware that there are several domestic policies that seek to monitor, prosecute, and stigmatize Muslims in Canada. These policies assign the presumption of guilt onto Muslims at large and diminish Muslim civil liberties. We're thinking here of the scrapped M103 study and the Islamophobic rhetoric that accompanied it, as well as the ban on religious symbols which unduly targets Muslim women and their hijabs in Quebec. So I ask you, how do you see these policies continuing to perpetuate Islamophobia? And my second question is, how do you see politicians fueling Islamophobia, and how does that impact the development of national security policies and legislation?
Merci beaucoup, Esra. Je suis vraiment heureuse d'être ici aujourd'hui.
Thank you very much.
I'm very happy.
I'm very happy to be here. This topic.
Thank you. Thank you for always being so kind to me. And you know, you all have, I was listening this morning, and other times you must have looked at facts and figures. And so I want to speak to you all more, not from the senator's point of view, but more from a practicing Muslim, woman politician who wants my Muslim community to be treated equally, and we to be able to practice our faith in peace. I just really believe that my definition of a country's national security is that comes from me being a member of the National Security and Defense Committee in the Senate. I was also vice chair for many years. And so I've had many years of experience on this issue. And for me, I truly believe that national security only as strong as the faith the community has in our security forces, such as CSIS, and what information the community gives to CSIS. If the community does not trust CSIS or any organization, the police or any, it's not going to be safe. The community is not going to be safe, and our country is not going to be safe. And so I want to share with you that there are for me, two types of Islamophobia. One is the personal, what Esra was discussing about the mosque, and then sadly the London tragic killings as well. And the other is the state Islamophobia. And I want to focus more on the state Islamophobia. And you know, there are the two types of acts that I said. There are heinous acts committed by individuals, like Esra was saying, the Quebec mosque. You know, I want to tell you that the Quebec mosque, it still hurts me. I went to see the family. And I met the mother who had not seen her son for years and years and years. Came from West Africa. She'd been there 3 days. 3 days, and her son got killed. And you know, that mosque was such a wake-up call for us politicians. What was interesting is that all politicians came together for the for the Quebec mosque. They came together for the London tragedy. But for me, that's the personal. But it's what policies government puts together is important. And I want to say to you, and Azra, tell me when I'm running out of time, I want to say to you that I arrived in the Senate. My swearing-in ceremony was 1 week after 9/11. So you can imagine, first Muslim senator arriving in the Senate a week after 9/11. And normally when you are sworn in at the Senate, there's quite a ceremony, and I found out later, I didn't know that day. And it's quite elaborate welcome to the Senate. But mine was very simple, and I understand because people were talking about terrorism. And I had 60 members of my family. My father was a politician in the audience, and I could see his hair just rising at the back of his neck when he heard the kinds of things senators were saying in the Senate about our faith. And he later on said to me, I had choices of going to so many countries. We are refugees from Uganda. I came to Canada thinking this was a place where we could live safely and practice our faith. But Canadian politicians don't know our faith. And it was a real wake-up call for me and for my family. And then, I want to say to you that the first week after my husband and I left Ottawa, and you can imagine, we were quite happy. Actually, we were buoyant. The first Muslim senator never dreamt of that. That's another day's topic of how it happened. But at the airport, my husband, who is with me here today, and he'll tell you to this day he's not forgotten it, he was practically, not quite, strip searched. And I was in such shock at what happened. And I'm saying to them, I just got sworn in as senator, and you think my husband's a terrorist? What are you doing? And I immediately went. At that time, I was very close to the ministers, and I said, what's this? And he said, well, you have to understand, it's teething pain, we have to do this, we have to do this. But if you're a Muslim, everybody, including my 8-year granddaughter, knows random checks. You know, go to the airport and observe around you who gets the random checks. And that's state Islamophobia. For years and years, I would tell my colleagues, see who will get the random check. Every Thursday night, we leave together to go home. I'm the only one who gets a random check. Every single time. My colleagues wait there because first they didn't believe it. That's state Islamophobia. And then, you know, we talk about Quebec and their law, but national is no better. We had the citizenship bill where the woman was not allowed to wear a niqab to the ceremony. And you know, that caused terrible, terrible damage in the community and to Canada. Then we had the barbaric practices law. And you know, I think I just died when I was on the Human Rights Committee. I fought the minister and said, you can't do this. You can't call us barbaric cultural practices. You can't. We come from colonial countries where we know what barbarism is. We were called that. You cannot do this to us. And of course, I wasn't heard. Soon as the government had lost power, first thing I did was change the title, and everybody said to me, it doesn't matter now, it's over. I said, no, for my community, it matters. You cannot call us barbaric. I mean, the content of the bill I could live with, but the title, and that's what this is, you know, government authorities Islamophobia. And, you know, there are so many more and more things I could say that the government does, but I want to say to you that I could go on, but I can say to you the one thing. When government does Islamophobia, when the Quebec government is doing this secular bill, when I talk to my Quebec colleagues about this secular bill, and they think they are freeing the woman because the woman is submissive. And I say to them, that's not for you to do. Whether I'm a Muslim woman, I choose not to wear a headdress, but I can if I want, and that's my right. I live in a democratic country, and you can't stop a person from dressing the way they want, how they feel. But you know, I tell my Quebec politicians, I challenge them, say, you continue like this, and you will lose the talent, the exceptional talent you have in the Quebec women that are amongst you, whom you're stopping from going to courts, into your education system. You are the losers. And so that's why today I want you, I see a lot of young people here, I want you to go away and not come together when there's a terrible thing like London or Quebec Mosque, but come together when there is state Islamophobia, authoritative Islamophobia. You know, I go to many places, and mothers call me and say to me, how can I go to the authorities to get help for my son, who I think is getting into wrong places? And I don't know even if it's terrorism, because I don't know how they will treat my son. And then forever my son is destroyed. Or a son might say, I'm being really groomed to go into this, I need help. But if I go for help, I'll be destroyed. I go to mosques, and they say, we know there's this one person, but if we call police here, or if we call CSIS here, our mosque will be closed down. There's a real fear in the community. For me, that is very dangerous, because I believe our security is only as strong as those people who live in the country. If part of the people in the country believe they cannot seek out help, then we are not going to be a strong country. So I want to give you two messages today. One is, Islamophobia doesn't really exist in our country. I've lived in this country for 50 years, not within Canadians. Yes, there are exceptions, I accept that, but it's greater within our authorities. There's greater within our authorities. You have no idea how many military places I go to train on Islamophobia, or to the police forces, That's where it exists, not by personal, but by their acts, by what the Terrorism Act does and what rights it gives. And that's what you should look at. And I lastly want to leave this message on this conference at the Canadian War Museum. If we really want to have peace in our country, we cannot continue to treat a very talented group of Muslims, very talented Muslim Canadians, as terrorists. You know, the one fear my family and every Muslim in this country has is when there is an attack. People pray, literally pray that it's not a Muslim, because there'll be a real problem. There'll be a real fear in the community. People use our name. They use our name to do terrorist acts, but our faith is of peace. And so when a Christian boy does a terrorist act, it's not called a Christian attack. But when a Muslim boy does, we are all marked with the same brush. And so I ask you next time when you see these things, question it. Because together, we are going to, especially you young people, you want to have peace in your country. And you won't have it if we don't treat everybody equally. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much, Senator Jafar, for introducing us to the institutional challenges related to tackling Islamophobia. I'm going to move on to Faisal Bhabha. So Faisal is an associate professor at Osgoode Hall Law School in Toronto, Ontario. He has researched and published in the areas of constitutional law, multiculturalism, law and religion, disability rights, national security, and access to justice. He teaches constitutional law, human rights, legal ethics, and appellate advocacy. Previously, he sat as vice chair of the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. He maintains a varied public and private law practice, appearing before administrative boards and tribunals and at all levels of court, including the Supreme Court of Canada. He advises and represents a variety of individuals and public interest organizations in matters pertaining to constitutional law and human rights. He has appeared as an expert witness before Canadian parliamentary committees and served as a member of the Equity Advisory Group of the Law Society of Ontario. Faisal has lived and worked in the Middle East and South Africa. He has also lectured and taught in many countries. So Faisal, I would like to ask you, what are the connections between national security and Islamophobia that manifest in Canada's defense and security policies? My second question to you is also, what have been some of the most alarming examples of Islamophobia for so many Muslims in Canada? Not just during airport screenings, but also interactions with law enforcement, online surveillance of Muslim communities, mosques, etc. And my last question to you is, what are some of the institutional challenges and hurdles we encounter as we try to hold CSIS, the RCMP, and the Human Rights Commissions accountable? Are they failing us?
Okay.
Faisal, go ahead.
Thank you very much. How long do I have?
About 10 minutes.
Okay. It's a delight to be here. I thank the organizers and everybody in attendance. That was a generous and lengthy bio. I guess I was invited to speak here because I'm a law professor and I specialize in constitutional law and human rights. I think also because I'm a Muslim Canadian. At the time that I was appointed to the full-time faculty at Osgoode Hall Law School, one of the oldest law schools in the country, I believe, I know that I was the first Muslim to be appointed to that particular law faculty in its 150-year history. And I believe I was, if not the first, one of the first and remain one of the only, to this day, full-time law professors in the country. And that's not, I'm not saying that to say anything about myself. I'm saying that to say something about our law faculties in our legal establishment. The one thing that isn't in my bio and that I don't actually talk about very much because it's not usually relevant, and that's really the only reason why I don't talk about it very much, but I feel like it's highly relevant today, is that I'm actually the grandson of a Canadian war vet. My maternal grandfather served in Europe in World War II, was shot by the Nazis, spent over a year in a POW camp in Germany, and came back and lived to educate his grandchildren about that experience. And so I grew up with my grandfather and his stories of time in battle, of injury, of recovery, of living a life of trauma from that experience, actually. I still remember when the film Saving Private Ryan came out, and he went to see it and spoke to me about his experience in the war more than he'd ever spoken about it before that time. He lived at the Pearly Veterans Hospital here in Ottawa, and I used to visit him regularly when I was coming to Ottawa to argue cases, including cases against the government, including cases alleging Islamophobia. Unfortunately, near the end of his life, he died in 2005, and we were close enough that I would visit him whenever I would come, but I was sad to see after 2001 his politics and his attitudes shifting considerably, and it became increasingly difficult for me to have a close relationship with him because of the impact of 9/11 on, and more importantly, I think, is the response to 9/11 of our government and of Western states generally that caused a certain culture to develop in certain circles, and that was a culture in which he was deeply immersed. And I'm really sorry to say it was the military culture, the security culture, in which the idea that Muslims are presumptively terrorists was very deeply held. And he wasn't that kind of person before 9/11, but he certainly became that kind of person after 9/11. So, you know, that kind of personal perspective really shaped, and I was in law school when 9/11 happened, and so my personal evolution was largely shaped by that event, and as I said, by the response to that event. As was mentioned earlier, when the events of 9/11 happened, Muslims who were old enough to understand what was happening, that thought of, oh goodness, what's going to happen? I mean, I remember when the Oklahoma City bombing happened. I was an undergraduate student, and we were running around, me and my friends were running around trying to figure out desperately who had done it, because early reports had labeled a quote-unquote Middle Eastern-looking man running away from that site. This was 1995. I still remember it so clearly because we felt the inherent vulnerability of that. And so that's to say that Islamophobia always existed, and Muslim fears of being associated with terrorism existed well before 9/11. But what happened with 9/11 was the official adoption of that narrative and its institutionalization in state practice. And so just a couple of things to try to answer those questions, at least with some preliminary responses. The definition of terrorism that was brought in a hurry 3 months after 9/11, so it was December of 2001 that Canada adopted its first Anti-Terrorism Act. And it was essentially we essentially gave up our sovereignty and adopted legislation that was dictated by allies. And in doing so, we essentially adopted the American War on Terror, which we now know was ill-defined and ill-conceived. And we adopted a definition of terrorism that was imprecise and could be deployed in ideological ways, and that's exactly what has happened. And more dangerously is it reinforced discourse in the public imagination that very clearly identified Muslims with terrorism. And so we've seen to this day non-Muslim people commit acts of carnage and destruction that creates fear in the public and that seeks to communicate some sort of ideological or political goal or message, the definition of terrorism, but they don't get prosecuted as terrorism offenses. And there's good reasons for that, actually. And my position has always been that we don't need a crime of terrorism. We've got enough crimes to classify terrible acts, and we've got the institutions and the practices to prosecute. All the crime of terrorism did, the adoption of a crime of terrorism did, was put a target on the backs of Muslims. And I can say the first time that I ever experienced racism directly was with my family in my hometown, with my mother, who's what the former Prime Minister called an old stock Canadian, or what people in her province call pure laine. But she wears a hijab because she converted to Islam 50 years ago. And we were berated by individuals in a shopping mall in my hometown, steps away from my place of birth, and told to go back to where we came from. This was me, my mother, and my father and my sister. And that was a jarring awakening, because at that point I was already an adult, and I appreciated that the country that I had been born and raised in had undergone a significant change. Something was happening. And I think the alarm bells didn't start ringing early enough. Thankfully, they're ringing now, but it's 20 years too late. And we have a whole generation of Canadian Muslims, people that I teach in law school, for example, who don't remember life before 9/11, and who don't trust the government, who don't believe that the rule of law does what it says, who don't believe that all Canadians are equal. And I've seen this in my own reality, and that's why I started by describing a little bit about my personal background, because notwithstanding the fact that my grandfather took a bullet for the country, spent time in a prison POW camp, I'm still perceived as in a unidimensional way, based on how I look or based on my name. And this is the reality, is that the Muslim community is extremely diverse, and you see it just in the diversity on this panel. And these dynamics that we're describing have the effect of reducing us to a single stereotype that has damaging consequences. So I think I'll pause there, and I'm happy to come back to get more into details in response to those questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Faisal. From what I'm hearing from Senator Jafar and Faisal, is that we've all experienced acts of Islamophobia, and this has affected every single Muslim in our nation, which just comes to show how serious this is. So I'm going to turn this over to Azeezah, and we have Azeezah Kanji, and she's a legal academic and writer. She received her Juris Doctor from the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law, and also a Master's of Law specializing in Islamic law from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Azeezah's work focuses on issues relating to racism, law, and social justice. Her writing has appeared in the Al Jazeera English, Haaretz, Toronto Star, Truth Out, National Post, Ottawa Citizen, Open Democracy, amongst very many other academic anthologies and journals. Azeezah also serves as the Director of Programming at Noor Cultural Center. So Azeezah, I would like to ask you, so many of us are familiar with the work you've done on the no-fly list kids as one of the most blatant examples of how Islamophobia and national security intersect. Can you speak to the necessity of doing this kind of advocacy and how it's impacted families? I'd also like to ask you, can you think of at least 3, even though we know there's a lot more, pieces of legislation that need serious reform and that actively harm Muslim communities? And my last question to you is, we haven't talked a lot about this, but national security, Islamophobia, and its impact on Muslim women. Why do you believe that these experiences are less discussed or heard from than Muslim men's experiences of Islamophobia and national security?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning, or maybe it's good afternoon by now. And salam alaikum, greetings of peace. Thank you, Esra. Thank you, Siham. Thank you, Kaha, for organizing this space in this conference to have this really critical conversation about this phenomenon of Islamophobia, which is so deeply entrenched and pervasive. I think it's deeply sad, but also telling that such a conversation would be considered provocative but it is perhaps a sign of the power of Islamophobia that it is simultaneously pervasive and omnipresent, and yet something which is largely out of bounds for critical discussion. So thank you for organizing this much needed space in this conference. As Esra mentioned, I'm from Toronto, Dagaranto, the ancestral territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and Mississaugas for many thousands of years. We are having this conversation about national security on land that is the unceded, unsurrendered territories of the Algonquin people. Over the last few weeks, the world has witnessed the violent ejection of the Wet'suwet'en land and water defenders from their ancestral unceded territories in what is for now called British Columbia, a testament to the ongoing brutality required to sustain a settler colonial state on Indigenous land. Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism, far from being an aberration or a post-9/11 innovation, have in fact been entwined for centuries with the genocidal anti-Indigenous violence that lies at the very foundations of the settler colonial state. And so, for example, papal edicts that set the stage for the enslavement and dispossession of Jewish and Muslim people during the Crusades formed the precedent for the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, which enabled the treatment of lands occupied by Indigenous peoples as empty lands, which then set the stage for the genocide of the American Indian Wars, precedents from which, in turn, have explicitly been cited by governments to support their practices during the War on Terror, building up a national security and war on terror apparatus that has been wielded against Indigenous land and water protectors in Canada and in the United States. Now, we see Canadian political leaders shedding tears at memorials and wringing their hands and saying, "This is not us," every time Muslims are shot down while praying in a mosque or mowed down while walking out in a public street. Even as the same political leaders uphold policies that brutalize, securitize, and dehumanize Muslims, largely out of sight. Internationally, with the continuing sale of arms to regimes that massacre Muslims, with the continuing opposition to mechanisms for international legal accountability through the International Criminal Court, for example, for Israel's crimes against the Palestinian people, with Canada's failure to repatriate Muslims who have been arbitrarily detained without charge in unlivable camps in northeast Syria. And domestically, within these colonial borders of the Canadian state, with the entire panoply of state practices, repressive practices, disproportionately wielded against Muslims, from security agent visitations to no-fly lists, to mass surveillance, to aggressive sting and entrapment operations, to extradition and deportation to serious risk of torture, to preemptive criminalization through peace bonds and counter-radicalization measures. The presumption of Muslim terrorist threat has created a situation wherein 98% of completed terrorism prosecutions have been against Muslims or individuals linked to Muslim groups, largely for acts very distant from any violence at all, even while white supremacists and right-wing actors have been responsible, according to CSIS's own statistics, for 8 to 12 times as many deaths as Muslims have in Canada since 9/11. While, as Professor Bhabha pointed out, the apparatus of securitizing war on terror measures has been built up and entrenched very quickly in Canada, Even the most basic and minimal measures to check these operations of violence against power against Muslims take years and years of struggle to implement, if in fact they are ever implemented at all. Over a decade ago, the Canadian Human Rights Commission called for the most elementary disclosure of race and religion disaggregated data on the operations of national security institutions, so that their claims that they are not engaging in racial and religious profiling can actually be publicly checked. A decade later, we have no such data available to us. And not only that, but the state's own official national security transparency commitments says nothing about race or religion disaggregated data at all. The very basic precondition we need in order to address Islamophobia and other forms of structural racism and national security practices. It took years and years of advocacy to even have January 29th, the day of the Quebec Mosque Massacre, recognized as a day of remembrance and action against Islamophobia. It took years and years of advocacy for the widows from the Quebec Mosque shooting to be recognized as victims entitled to victims' compensation from the state. It took years and years of legal struggle against government obduracy for the victims of torture with Canadian complicity in gross violation of international law to obtain any compensation, with the Canadian government continuing to spend $2 million per year to fight the compensation claims of one survivor, Abu Sufyan Abdurrazik. It took years and years and years of dedicated advocacy to have children who have grown up being on the no-fly list, under the stigmatizing shadow of the no-fly list, for no reason other than happening to have the same name as someone else. It took years and years and years of dedicated advocacy to even have a way for them to be able to get off the no-fly list, despite the universal acknowledgement that they were there simply by mistake. Malcolm X famously said that if someone sticks a knife in your back 9 inches and pulls it out 6 inches, that is not progress. What we are asked as Muslims to be grateful for these minimal measures of mitigation against these regressive measures, is the 6 inches out after the 9 inches has been put in. That is not progress. It is minimal mitigation of regression. As Senator Jaffer said, one of the most pernicious, and from my perspective as a Muslim woman, insulting aspects of Islamophobia is its ability to disguise itself as a progressive politics, as a politics dedicated to the liberation and salvation of Muslim women, even as Muslim women continue to not only bear the greatest brunt of hate crimes and other private violence inflicted by Islamophobes, but also bear the burden of oppressive laws advertised as saving Muslim women while actually harming them, for example, hijab and niqab bans, as well as bearing the burden that is inflicted on Muslim women when their families and their communities are securitized and criminalized. Women like Dr. Khadija Metwali, who has been forced to become an advocate for her son, Abdurrahman al-Banasawi, who is currently imprisoned in a supermax prison in the United States after being subject to an aggressive sting operation as a youth, following the sharing of his information, his mental health information that marked him as a vulnerable target for an entrapment operation. Women like Sophie Harkat, the wife of security certificate detainee Muhammad Harkat, who has written so disturbingly and movingly about the absolutely destructive impacts, the extreme surveillance measures she and her family have been forced to live under, so extreme that Muhammad Harkat actually said he would have preferred to have been back in prison so that these damaging effects that have inflicted his whole family would not have been experienced. He would rather have been back in prison, even though he has never actually been charged with any crime. In this perverted, perverse universe of national security discourse, we now see that the latest feminist development is not, in fact, examining the gendered and sexual violences that have been inflicted against Muslim women and against Muslim men in the course of the War on Terror. But instead, the feminist development is to now supposedly acknowledge Muslim women's agency by recognizing their ability to either serve as informants on their communities or themselves to be considered threats of terrorism in and of themselves. And so not just passive victims, but active terrorists. This is considered a recognition of Muslim women's agency. As the great scholar and activist Angela Davis said in the context of the carceral state, equality means not liberating people from prisons, but simply putting as many women in prisons as there are men. Similarly, in the context of the national security state, we see how equality means, in fact, further extending the arm and the gaze and the scope of the securitizing gaze to also capture Muslim women and not simply Muslim men in its grasp. Recently, I was preparing with a friend who's a community leader for a presentation he was asked to give to the National Security Transparency Advisory Group. And the questions that were put to him by this group, which is supposed to be an arm's-length civilian body that's exercising scrutiny over national security institutions, the questions were deeply revealing of the extreme limitations that we have in not even addressing Islamophobia, but even understanding it as a phenomenon. The questions all revolved around things like, why don't Muslims trust national security institutions? How can we get Muslims to trust and engage with CSIS and RCMP, while at the same time asking whether there should be a boundary or a border between community outreach and intelligence gathering, as if the very fact that that question needs to be asked doesn't speak volumes about why Muslims would have mistrust about engagement with these agencies, which under the guise of outreach instead conduct further surveillance and intelligence gathering instead. These types of questions speak volumes about the complete inability and the unwillingness to not only address Islamophobia and structural racism in national security practices, but indeed to even admit or acknowledge its nature. A racism which is not simply a question of unconscious biases or individual aberrations to be solved with further inclusion and diversity, but rather a racism that has been deeply woven into the fabric of the very way that ideas of national security, threat, and terrorism have been conceptualized. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Azeezah. I'm emboldened by the anti-racist approach you use to ground your advocacy and expertise. I now want to turn it over to Kofi. Kofi Achampong is a Toronto-based lawyer, community advocate, and public affairs government relations professional. As a lawyer, Kofi's practice has focused on human rights, employment, criminal law, and civil litigation, with a number of client files that have highlighted the intersection of national security with the aforementioned areas of law. As a community advocate, Kofi has regularly lent his voice in consultative services to issues at the intersection of anti-Black racism and Islamophobia, including stakeholder engagement on the Ontario Human Rights Commission's report on anti-Black racism and policing, as well as the federal government's national strategy on countering radicalization to violence. Kofi, I have 3 questions for you. My first question is, what are the ways that police investigations impact Muslim communities in their day-to-day lives? My second question is, your work as a lawyer has put you in contact with clients that experience Islamophobia and the stigma that comes with it in workplace environments. And can you speak more to the lived reality for Muslims that deal with seeking employment and how national security policies impact their ability to secure jobs? And this will be a question that will be directed to all of the panelists. What do you believe Muslims can do to hold government institutions accountable when their rights have been infringed upon?
Okay, can everybody hear me? All right. I've been feeling a bit cold up here, but Azeezah's comments have sort of heated up the stage a little bit, I think. So I certainly appreciate that. First and foremost, I want to also just say thank you to the organizers of this conference, WCAPS as well, for inviting me to share some thoughts on this very challenging, complex, and very pervasive issue. I just want to first and foremost start off by just reiterating what the senator had said, which is, I think, indicative of a point that is often lost on law enforcement, on institutions that are charged with issues relating to national security and defense and whatnot, which is that the Muslim community is not a monolith. I understand the reflexive nature often to as human beings that we have to not to oftentimes group individuals. It's something that many of us do. We all have these sort of habits, and it doesn't matter what your background is. We sometimes all sort of fall into these streams of consciousness that limit our ability to truly see issues and understand them in their true essence. So I think it's first and foremost important to understand that when we're talking about the Muslim community, we're talking about a very diverse community. Muslims comprise approximately 3.5% of the Canadian population. They come from every part of the world. Some of them look like me. You wouldn't know I'm Muslim by my name, by my appearance. Some wear niqab, some wear hijab. Some pray, some don't pray. Some are more culturally Muslim, some are more religiously Muslim, some are converts. I'm also a convert, which means I didn't grow up as a Muslim. I only became Muslim maybe a little bit over 10 years ago. So Muslims come in all forms with varying degrees of attachment to religiosity, to practice, to opinion, and you're going to see that reflected as you engage the Muslim community. I've been listening to parts of this conference and trying to sort of think about, what's the common denominator between, some of the topical issues that are being discussed here around gray space and, securitization and diversity. What does that have to do with, and Islamophobia? What does that have to do with each other? And they have a lot to do with each other, if you think about it. Although you wouldn't know it because there's a diversity panel, right? We've segmented diversity away from this harder conversation, right? Which is oftentimes something that happens in conversation about any academic subject. You have I'm originally an IR student, so I study international relations at U of T as well. You have these conversations that, leave this concept of diversity outside of the normative sort of solutions that are sort of developed in fields like international relations. And then you have a whole other academic discipline that's sort of geared towards criticizing these normative takes. And they kind of live in their own kind of worlds. There's critical studies world, and then there's hard IR and defense world. But you kind of have to bring them together if you're really talking about addressing threats to your national security. And I live in the real world, so there are threats to national security. At the same time, those threats look very different, and your solutions are going to look very different if you don't learn to understand the people with whom you're seeking to protect and work with. Oftentimes in security space and defense space, what you'll find is a institution that has no understanding whatsoever of the population that comprises this jurisdiction that we call Canada. Again, even that needs to sort of be taken into account because there's still very competing claims about what Canada is. And there are many communities that don't see themselves necessarily as part of Canada and that are fighting the concept of Canada and what it means historically for their rights and their identities. So we can't think of things in a very monolithic way without seeing the tensions and complexities that comprise this landmass that we all occupy as a broad Canadian community, if you will. So all this to say that, hearing about the threats of, cybersecurity warfare and whatnot, and I think to myself, the greatest strength isn't going to come from, our capacity to develop new technologies, to track, to, disaggregate information, and to know where these threats are coming from necessarily from a technical standpoint. The greatest threat is going to come from not having individuals in our country who literally believe that this country represents what it represents. To me, that's the greatest threat. And that's the threat that's being exploited by other countries in the world who are simultaneously engaged in all kinds of nefarious actions to undermine Canada as and other Western democracies. But what we're doing is we're helping them. Right? Why we're helping them because we as a society, and when I say we, I'm really speaking to the leadership at the institutional levels of this country. And we're in a room with folks in defense and national security. We got to speak a little truth to power here. Yeah, we have to acknowledge that this country has a very distinct past that has created a stratification that is racialized, that is clear, that is rooted in ideologies that have been racist. I think we can acknowledge that. And that still struggles with acknowledging that reality. And still struggles with dealing with decentralizing and democratizing power as a result of that. If democracy is truly the West's greatest strength, it must learn to democratize power at its greatest level. And if you can't do that, you're not going to get the smartest people to counter threats. You're not going to get people who sincerely believe in what Canada and America and all these liberal democracies claim to represent. And I understand, I'm a lawyer, so I'm not ignorant to the realities that words on paper oftentimes don't mean anything, right? But we are in a project as human beings here to try and create lives for people and families. And what our panel ultimately is talking about, whether it's Islamophobia, whether it's sexism, whether it's anti-Black racism, whatever form of discrimination we're talking about things that undermine the cohesion, connection, and believability of what this country seemingly represents. So I just want to I feel like that's a long preface, I apologize, but I just have to say that. Now, with respect to the question of how policing impacts Muslim communities, that's a very big question, because it impacts Muslim communities from all aspects, from the investigatory stage, what constitutes a crime, who is investigating the crime. Overwhelmingly, it's going to look like a reinforcement of this sort of stratified society I'm talking about. What victims oftentimes feel as they're dealing with law enforcement and police. So many clients, of course, will right away, even if they are themselves victims or witnesses, be treated as suspects in the Black community and in the Muslim community. And don't get me started on the Black Muslim community. Okay, Black Muslims comprise about maybe 10% of the Muslim community in Canada as well. And they are overwhelmingly concentrated in specific places in this country. And I'm part of a community group that's working on a study right now that's trying to sort of disaggregate their socioeconomic standing. I can almost guarantee you that they're going to be on the lower rungs of most of these data indicators, which indicates to me that they are the ones who are going to be over-surveilled. They're going to be the ones who can't find opportunities for long-term job prospects, whose kids are going to struggle with many aspects of what it means to live in poor and low-income environments, and then feel the sense of disaffection and dislocation that comes with that, and not being able to see themselves reflected in the society that they're growing up with. So naturally they see themselves as outsiders eventually in this society. This is obviously not everybody. Don't get me wrong, but many of them will oftentimes end up in this sort of situation. And then they're over-policed, overwhelmingly by people that don't look like them, that have no conception whatsoever of their religion or their culture, that can't differentiate between so many aspects of their life. No wonder, they're going to struggle, with all these obstacles in place. But what policing looks like, I would say, is quite similar to what Azeezah was talking about. It's lack of transparency. It's blatant lying on warrants. It's sweeping projects where they just go into people's homes and, irrespective of really concrete hard evidence, it's overcharging. 70% of charges are withdrawn. Over 70% of charges are withdrawn in Ontario. So and of course, the vast majority of people who are being charged tend to be people of color, and so you're compounded with this sense of reinforcement in which you are the othered, the surveilled person in the state, right? And law enforcement is being used as a tool, oftentimes, to disempower and to remind you, in essence, that you're here to be surveilled. How are you going to build, a national security infrastructure, a defense infrastructure that includes this community? How are you going to do that? Of course, that if I cannot trust these institutions, I'll go online and see disinformation, and I can't tell the difference between that because your rhetoric doesn't match your action. So what difference does it make who I believe, whether it's coming from Russia or China or whatever, what have you? We have to acknowledge that there is really a problem, and the seeds of undermining Canadian cohesion lies in our institutions and our inability to truly, genuinely engage the people who live in this country. It also looks like, I'm so sorry, it also looks like discounting mental health, right? It's not understanding the realities of mental health. People in security and law enforcement have no clue what mental health is. How can you police, how can you secure, you don't know what mental health is? This is fundamentally the issue of our day over the last two years, arguably, that people have come to understand how mental health impacts on every people's lived realities. I could go on. I think you had two more questions, but I'll stop there for now. But yeah, it looks like over surveillance. It looks like forms of entrapment. It looks like a criminal justice system that is completely stratified. You go into any court, you'll see that overrepresentation there. It looks like prosecutors who are overwhelmingly white, senior ones at the highest level are overwhelmingly white. So we're dealing with a society that has to acknowledge the racialized element of power and exclusion at the highest levels. And again, that goes to the issues of hiring and promotion that the government talks a lot about, but I'm not sure how serious they are about addressing that. We can talk a lot more about that.
Thank you so much, Kofi, and thank you for emphasizing why intersectionality is critical to our dialogue on national security. So I know we've hit 12:30, but we know we do have some questions. 5 more minutes? Okay, so I see a question up on the screen. So maybe we can kind of start with that. So the question that we have on the screen is, what strategies can we as individuals take to cause a change in Quebec's current illegal and unconstitutional law that bans hijabi women from a career in public service? And we'll start in order, starting with Senator Jafar.
Thank you. I'll just say very quickly is to fundraise and have the best lawyers like Dr. Faisal go to courts and fight this. That's one way of doing it. And secondly, it's to encourage people that look like us to be in the legislature to change laws. That's long term, but the immediate is to go to court.
Not wishing to disagree with my esteemed co-panelist, and as a constitutional lawyer with some actually connection to the legal challenge that's going on in Quebec right now, my opinion as a legal scholar is that solutions to this particular kind of problem lie outside of the law. And I think we need a more engaged politics. We need people, non-Muslims, to be more engaged on these issues. The question sounds like it's coming from that kind of a place. So to that person, get involved with your community and get involved in politics, because I think the law is there to mitigate and to stop the worst things from happening and to provide some compensation, maybe after the fact. It's not there to change the systems. That's something that only we can do as human beings acting together.
May I just please, not wanting to disagree, I agree with everything he said, he's the expert, but having been in politics and knowing how difficult it is to change anything, I can tell you, I've been a senator for 20 years, and it'll take many, many more of us. It'll take a long time to get there, so we need to do both.
And I've been losing cases for 20 years.
We have a panel full of unsuccessful Muslims up here telling you what to do. But you know, it wouldn't be a panel of 4 Muslims unless you had 5 or 6 different opinions. You know, we can disagree with each other and also disagree with ourselves. So not being from Quebec, I don't want to be too prescriptive on this. And I think the narrative that exceptionalizes Islamophobia as a particularly Quebecois problem is extremely damaging. It obscures the nature of Islamophobia as well as perpetuates the pathologization of Quebec. But we know that these narratives that represent Muslim women in hijab as backwards, as unliberated, as in need of saving, as a problem, are actually popular across the country. Often we conceptualize Islamophobia as a problem of an absence of knowledge that can be solved just with more information, with people getting to know Muslims better, with, you know, seeing 4 Muslims on a panel. But in fact, the problem of Islamophobia isn't simply an absence of knowledge, it's the active production of narratives in order to justify it. And so Charles Mills, the great Black philosopher, famously analyzed the phenomenon of what he called white ignorance, which was not simply a deficit of knowledge, but the active propagation of knowledge that sustains narratives of white supremacism. And so similarly here, we have the active perpetuation of narratives that pathologize Muslims and justify the imposition of exceptional measures in order to discipline and control them. In the context of Quebec, I think one of the primary obfuscatory narratives has been the idea that this may be a good faith secularism initiative, that it's about preserving the religious neutrality of the state. But in fact, when you look at data support for the bill, or among supporters of the law, antipathy towards Islam is much higher than antipathy towards other religious traditions, including Christianity and Catholicism, which is said to be the source of Quebec's particular antagonism towards establishment of religion. So I think first and foremost, we have to understand this as not about liberating Muslim women, not about protecting secularism, but an instance of the institutionalization and legalization of a phenomenon of Islamophobia, which transcends Quebec and is pervasive nationally. Thanks.
I would just say, realistically, I mean, there just aren't enough white Quebecers who care enough about the concerns of racialized Muslim women and people to take up the cause. As minorities, it's not realistic to expect that in a society like Quebec, you're going to be able to have, the majority you need to sway public discourse. If you were to democratize the debate around Bill 21 and what it's really saying, there are very good arguments, arguably on both sides. Although, I mean, obviously, I would disagree with the essence of the bill, but there's going to be arguments that are going to be put forward, and you're going to find some Muslims who actually support elements of the bill, and some Muslims, majority of which I would suggest probably would not. But at the end of the day, those Muslims are at a demographic deficit in Quebec, and so their rights can be trampled if the majority decide that their rights are to be trampled, and they can make any argument at knowing that politically there is no consequence for that. So ultimately, what's required are allies. Are people who recognize a wrong when they see a wrong, an overreaction when they see an overreaction, an overcorrection when they see an overcorrection, and to say that I'm not going to be a bystander and a witness to the creation of this type of society that undermines, what we think are rights. And rights are constantly competing with each other and being argued, and this is what makes Canada and parts of the world great, that we fight and we let people have discussion. And it's incredible. It's an incredible thing to see. I worked in the legislature in Ontario for a long time, and it's great to see. It's an incredible thing to see. But we have to recognize when we see a wrong, and those who are in a position of power, who have the ability to speak to a constituency that is the majority, they have to speak. Because it can't be left to Muslims and Muslim women and Muslim organizations who are vastly outnumbered to be advocating for themselves alone. So I'll say that.
Thank you so much, Kofi. And thank you, everyone, for listening to us. I think this was a really great discussion, and I think really sheds light to how important this issue is. And if we continue to kind of perpetuate these injustices, it's only harming our nation and preventing us from achieving real progress. So again, thank you so much, everybody. I will move it on or turn it over to Steve. Thank you.
Thank you, Ezra, and I want to thank the panel. I think this was a really important conversation that we had and we will keep on having. I really liked Kofi's last statements about that bystanders can't be bystanders. This speaks to a lot of things that will come up again when we talk about cultural change in the CAF later on. That we need to, when we see things, we need to say something, and we need to act. And so I think from the start to finish, this was a really moving and important panel that gave us a really interesting perspective, an important perspective, and a diverse perspective on Islamophobia and national security. I want to thank particularly Ezra. We delegated to Ezra and her new organization, Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security Canada, the job of putting this together. So the credit is entirely due to her and her organization. It's a very new organization that fills an important gap in Canada. There aren't very many organizations that bridge national security defense with people who have been historically excluded from these conversations and from political power. And so we're very happy that you can do this time around. And unfortunately, the challenge is that if you do this really well, we'll ask you to do it again. So thanks again for your time, for the expertise of everybody on the panel. Just for clarity's sake, the food will be delivered to us, so just wait and it'll come to you. But this is also time to get out and breathe some kind of air and use the facilities and all the rest. We'll be back here at 1:30 for the next panel. So thank you very much to our panelists today.